the most famous and best-known UFO case in the world, the UFO crash at Roswell in New Mexico. In 1993, a letter crossed my desk from a gentleman called Ray Santilli that would change things forever. He did go on to mention that he had film of the Roswell UFO crash. Not only did he have some film footage of Roswell, but the actual aliens themselves being dissected, an alien autopsy.
An alien autopsy is always going to be the subject of ridicule. Who's going to believe an alien autopsy is an alien autopsy? It's just a ridiculous subject.
I did get to the bottom of it. It just took me a lot longer than I expected.
Interestingly, internal communications from the CIA have been released where they're actually talking about alien autopsy back then and verifying that they believe that the footage is real and they've seen it themselves.
Perhaps in the desert of Roswell, New Mexico, in 1947, we had first contact with beings not of this earth. When I rather naively began my involvement, I expected to read a few books, ask a few questions, maybe write a few letters, and I'd have all the information I could ever dream of. I've certainly found some of those answers down the years, but by no means have I found them all. My name is Philip Mantle, and I've been involved in UFO research for 40 years. During that 40 years, you know, I've researched and investigated UFO cases of every description, really. Probably best known for my involvement in the alien autopsy film.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
The town of Roswell was in the middle of the desert in New Mexico, and its main employer was the Roswell Army Air Force Base that was nearby. And one night in early July, there was a lightning storm. And the next day, on a sheep rancher's property, a chap called Matt Brazel came out to inspect his sheep one day and found this wreckage across his land. The sheep wouldn't go anywhere near it. He'd never seen this type of material before. He didn't have a telephone. He didn't even have electricity on his ranch. So he took some of this material to his neighbour, a lady by the name of Loretta Proctor at a nearby ranch. And she advised him to take it into the town. She said it might be something to do with the military. So he waited a few days until he had to go into town for something, and he gathered some of this material up and took it to the sheriff. And that was Sheriff George Wilcox. Again, Sheriff Wilcox had never seen anything like it. So we put in a phone call to the Roswell Army Air Force, which seemed the obvious thing for him to do.
I was called to headquarters, was given copies of a press release which stated in essence that we had in our possession a flying disc. I was told to hand deliver to the 4 news media we had in town at that time, 2 radio stations and 2 newspapers.
That, of course, then went out on the wire service, the local radio covered it, and the story shot around the world. You know, the sheriff did say we're getting phone calls from, you know, all 4 corners of the globe. So that's how we got to know about it, not through any unofficial statement, but from an official press release. Within hours, in fact, the next newspaper the following day, they retracted that, said, sorry, big mistake, it was a weather balloon. The Roswell Army Air Force housed what is known as the 509th Bomb Group, and they were the only atomic bomb wing in the world. It was the 509th, for example, that dropped the atomic bombs on Japan to end the Second World War. So this wasn't some little, you know, airbase stuck out in the middle of nowhere. It was a very important installation. It was a very different world than we have here today. There was very real fear that the US and the Soviet Union were heading for war, and that war would be a nuclear war. So there was still a great respect for officialdom, certainly in the military. Both the US and the USSR in opposite direction were keeping tabs on each other. We know that the atomic bomb was designed and invented in the United States. However, the secrets were leaked to the Soviets, so they did have atomic bombs, and the US were keeping a close eye on them the best they could. So tensions were very real in 1947, and there were many that suspected that you know, war could well be imminent. Primarily, if the military said something was so-and-so, then you'd probably believe them. A lot of people in the town may have even served in the military at one point. The town depended on the airbase for its living during those days. Certainly did have an effect. After the telephone call went to the airbase from the sheriff, they dispatched their intelligence officer, which was Lieutenant Jesse Marcel. He took with him a gentleman called Sheridan Cavett, and they made their way out to the Brazil Ranch and collected some of this material. And on the way back, Marcel stopped at his home. He didn't live on the base, he lived off base with his wife and his 11-year-old son, Jesse Marcel Jr.
When he came in, he was very excited. He woke my mother and myself up at must have been 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and he wanted us to see what he was bringing in from the field. He said, this is parts of a flying saucer. And it was all brought in and spread out on the kitchen floor. And we just looked at it.
Young Marcel picked up a rod about this long that looked edge on like a capital letter I. So it got the nickname of an I-beam.
You know, I picked up this particular I-beam and held it up to my upper left to look at it with the kitchen light reflecting on the inner surface. And that's when I saw the writing or the symbols of some sort. I thought at first, this is hieroglyphics or some kind of writing like that. It certainly looked alien to me.
And his father said, son, you may be the first person to ever see writing from another world. He gathered the stuff up and took it back to the base. There are some people, even today, who say, well, you know, the military did make a mistake, and it was indeed simply a balloon, but attached to a secret project. Hence, you know, the reason for keeping it quiet. You go back to Major Marcel himself. They used to release weather balloons twice a day from the Air Force Base. He'd been trained in how to do this. He knew what a weather balloon looked like. And he said, that material that I posed for in his office was a weather balloon. But that wasn't the material that I picked up that day on the ranch. He claimed that there'd been a switch, and he was told to keep quiet and say nothing. Why the cover-up was put into place is still hotly debated. But you have to remember, this is just after the Second World War, so people were used to keeping secrets, and the nature of the airbase itself, it was a nuclear facility. So, you know, secrets were part of everyday routine.
I sincerely believe we had the crash of something from outer space, because we still don't have materials that compare with the descriptions I've gotten of the material that was picked up out on the ranch and brought into town.
He couldn't figure this out. There were some other bits and pieces, the likes of which he'd never seen before. This was the puzzling thing. They had seen weather balloons and things of that nature, but nothing like this at all.
I think at last count, I had spoken to around 4 dozen people who handled various aspects of the debris. The most dramatic is the foil-like material that you could wad up in a ball and let it go and it would unfold itself.
Matt Brazel, like Sheriff Wilcox and others, claimed that some of this material was almost looked like tin foil. But it was very light, and when you rolled it up or crushed it in your hand and then let go again, it would immediately unfurl and go back to its original shape without any creases or bends or dints. And it got the nickname of memory metal.
They tried to burn it and they couldn't burn it. It wouldn't catch on fire, and they took out their pocket knives and they tried to cut it and they couldn't cut it. I guess they all had their chance to play with it for a while, and it was laying on the table, so I reached over and picked it up. And I played for it probably about 5 minutes. When you would wad it up in your hand, you couldn't feel it in your hand. You couldn't feel you had anything there. And it would go to a size that was so small that you'd have to look to see if it was still in your hand. And then when you drop it, it spread out all over the table. Daddy came in so excited, and he said what they saw was not from this world. There were 2 bodies that were laying on the ground outside of this craft, and that there was one, what he called little person. And he said there's one little person that was walking around, and he said they were still alive. And he said that the other 2 were dead, and that this one that was alive was very sad. My dad would not have gotten excited over a weather balloon. He was not easily excitable, and this is the most thrilled I'd ever seen him in my life. He thought that was the most fantastic thing in the world.
When you go back to Roswell and look at the various eyewitnesses, not many of them stepped forward at that time in 1947, simply because there was no avenue for them to do so. It wasn't until some years later, when in the late 1970s, nuclear physicist and UFO researcher Stanton Friedman met Colonel Marcel. He was in retirement now, and he was introduced to him by a TV station who knew about his story. Then the word got out. Roswell became news. He was featured in television and newspapers and so on. And it's only when that happened then other people who were there at the time stepped forward. Some went on the record, others, in confidence. Some were also found by UFO researchers. They'd look who was serving in the military at the airbase at that time and were able to track them down and find them. So many of the airmen and civilian witnesses as well went on the record. So the investigation to Roswell started in earnest in the late 1970s and it's still ongoing even today. There's been lots of first-hand witnesses from the military go on the record. Even young Marcel himself, he became a doctor, a medical doctor and a flight surgeon, served in the military himself. He's gone on the record, wrote his own book about it, spoke at conferences. Sadly, he's no longer with us. So a lot of the people who were there, either first or second hand, stepped forward. There is this threatening aspect of the Roswell story, but again, we have to remember it was a different era and a different time. So there were those, certainly in the military, if they were told to keep quiet, then they would do exactly that. That was their duty, and that's the way they were trained, and that's the way that they acted. A number of the military witnesses didn't go on the record for a long time, perhaps when they were in the twilight of their own life. And they thought, well, if I don't say something now, then I'll never have the opportunity. And that seems to be the case on a number of occasions.
The best evidence we have from a number of eyewitness sources is that the craft and the bodies were brought to Hangar 84 on the Roswell Army Airfield and stored overnight before transport. What we understand from the eyewitness testimony is the bodies were sealed in a large wooden crate kept at the center of the hangar. It's absolutely brilliant what they did. They announced they have a flying saucer, but they've already captured it. They've already got it. There's nothing to see, so nobody goes out looking for the thing. Then they shift everything to Fort Worth. The higher headquarters says, no, those guys made a mistake. It was just a weather balloon.
One of the sinister things about the Roswell affair is that there are claims that the military not only ordered the people under their command to stay quiet, but also civilian witnesses.
The press can't find Jesse Marcel because he's in Fort Worth and he's been silenced.
You know, when he came back from Carswell, after flying the debris, he did tell me not to talk about this, told my mother not to talk about this. This is a non-event. Play like it never happened. Don't even talk about this with your friends, which I didn't. And years later, he confided that he was actually part of the cover-up because he went along with the Air Force explanation, even though he knew full well that that was not true.
There's corroborative testimony that suggests somebody was putting pressure on people to silence them, and they used what means were necessary to keep those people silent. With some of the civilians, they were told that if you ever talk about it, you will be killed.
For example, there's a lady by the name of Frankie Rowe. Her father was a firefighter. It's claimed that they were dispatched to the event, and he managed to somehow acquire a piece of this memory metal and show it to her. You know, she was his daughter. Shortly afterwards, they were visited by members of the military with a stern warning, and I mean a very stern warning, that keep quiet about this and say nothing. You know, bullets are cheap, so to speak.
I said, yes, I did handle it. And he started emphasizing, no, you didn't. Well, my mother was pretty strict, and we didn't lie. So I'm insistent that, yes, I saw it, yes, I held it. And he got mad, and he got louder, and he had one of those, looks like a small baseball bat that hooks on the side of your belt, and he took that out, and he's holding it, and he starts beating his hand. Every time he said something, he would hit that on his hand. And he would say, I want you to understand, you were never there. You did not see anything. You did not hear a conversation. And he said, if you can't understand this, there are things that we can do. He said, we could take you out here in the middle of this desert. He said, this is a big desert here. He said, no one will ever find your bodies, ever. No one will ever know what happened to you. He said, the only way I'm going to let you stay around or live is if you promise you'll never talk about this the rest of your life. So I told him I wouldn't.
And that was a reoccurring theme every now and again, both with civilian and military witnesses. The wreckage at the time, and it even says this in the newspaper cuttings, was flown to Wright Field, as it was called, and it's now called Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, still in operation, and it's claimed that that is where the wreckage and possibly even the bodies were studied, officially studied, and it was in a mythical, almost mythical hangar, given the number of Hangar 18. There are those that claim that when the wreckage was studied at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, it was drip-fed secretly into civilian research programs, and that it may have helped the technology for the space race, for example.
Good Lord, ride all the way. Keep Godspeed, John Glenn.
Silicon chips, fiber optics, and eventually all the way through to the stealth technology that we see in the aircraft. That is a rumor, it's not proven, but there are those that say that, you know, most of the technology that was found that day at Roswell are still yet to be identified, and we haven't been able to reverse engineer it at all. The story got a new lease of life, certainly in the 1980s. Stanton Friedman, sadly no longer with us, but he was the main civilian researcher of the Roswell incident. And he had no doubt whatsoever that this was a crash of a vehicle that was not of this earth, and that a cover-up was put in place almost immediately, one that is still intact today. And I think it was Stanton who coined the phrase the cosmic Watergate. So he had no doubt that A, it was an alien vehicle, and B, there's a cover-up.
How about the analysis of the materials? How about the autopsy reports? How about the eyewitness testimony from those who stood guard, those who carried it, those who tested at various government labs? There ought to be a ton of other paper.
Stanton was a diligent researcher, and he would track down and interview witnesses to the event. He was also one of those that would be quite happy to spend days researching through government archives to find documentation of one form or another. And he was literally, once he got his teeth into something, he was like a dog with a bone. And he did uncover a number of witnesses. He interviewed just about anybody and everybody. But what he also did was help spread the word. You know, he was the man that actually put Roswell on the map. And gradually, you know, the UFO story was out there for all of us to digest. Roswell, the town itself is still thriving. The Air Force Base closed many years back. Back in the 1980s, some documents known as Majestic 12 or Magic 12 were leaked, and it mentioned here that, you know, the bodies and other things were studied at a secret base. And of course, put two and two together, and that secret base is alleged to be Area 51.